Thank you so much for joining me today once again. I see some familiar faces. I love you all. I want to wish you a happy 4th of July, the Independence Day in America. Well, some of you are not from America, so you may not be celebrating this holiday. And one of the things that I always do on Independence Day is I actually encourage people to celebrate interdependence. And the idea, of course, is that we want to celebrate interdependence in addition to independence, to find balance. By balance, I mean we learn how to develop both independence, sense of autonomy, sense of self-agency, if you will, on one hand. And on the other hand, there is also interdependence that we want to acknowledge and celebrate as well. And interdependence means that we are all connected, that we are all part of this intricate web of life. And we also know that we are not that different from other people. We are not that different from the people who either are our neighbors or live on the other side of the world. We all have common human nature. We all have a common destiny, if you will, as a species. And that's something that I wanted to discuss with you today, because if we recognize the commonality of our human nature and the oneness of our human destiny as a species, it may give us access to tremendous level of resources that otherwise would not be available to us. What I mean by that is that most people do not recognize their interdependence. There have been several psychological studies done that tested people or questioned people on their recognition of connectedness with the whole of life and everything in the universe. And most people responded that they did not really think about this at all, or they thought about it very seldom. What it means is that most people don't recognize our own human nature. And without recognition of our nature, it's really hard to be a fully operational human being. By fully operational or optimized human being, I mean a human being that is fully functional, is socially responsible, is responsible for one's own experiences in life, and also he or she participates in making the world a better place. Sounds like a cliche, but those of us who do not feel like we are involved in making our world a better place often experience a sense of dissatisfaction or feeling like there's something wrong. Have you ever felt that nagging sense that there's something wrong with you or with your world? Well, that's usually the result of a lack of connection with our nature. Basically, if we do not connect with our nature, we operate on a superficial level of human consciousness, superficial level of our motivations. We often are influenced by other people's influences, or by the media, or by society at large. And that creates a life where we pursue things that are not intrinsic to us. We end up pursuing extrinsic things. By extrinsic things, I mean things that are motivated by other people's influences, status, peer pressure, the sense of satisfying certain requirements of your social milieu, and that creates a sense that you are not really living your own life. It creates disconnect with the true nature of who you really are. And the true nature of who you are is the same true nature of who I am and who every one of us is. Once we recognize that interconnectedness, that sense of oneness, because our nature is the same, that is what creates a much deeper sense of satisfaction with life. Because then we realize we're not just pursuing what we think is good or important, we are actually making our world a better place. Now, who wouldn't want that? Who would not want to live in a world that is a better place? Well, everyone wants to live in a better world, but not very many people actually make the world a better place. So, in order to transition from our habitual way of thinking about ourselves and our world and the universe at large to a way of thinking that allows us to live an optimal life as a fine-tuned human being. By fine-tuned meaning tuned into our inner nature. We need to actually change a few of our values, priorities, beliefs, and that's something that very many people would say, wait a moment, I don't want to change my beliefs. My beliefs are that which I have been believing since childhood, so why would I want to change that? Well, if it's working for you, great, don't change anything. If something is not working, on the other hand, that may be an invitation to make a few changes. What kind of changes would you want to make to your beliefs? Well, let's start with an obvious one, that beyond the surface appearances, everything is fundamentally one. Everything is based on the same essence that permeates everything. That essence is what we call energy. In Chinese, they call it qi. In Sanskrit, they call it prana. There are many ways to talk about it, but the essence of it is basically that everything is made of the same substance, and that substance is energetic in nature. The modern scientists agree with that, as well as the ancient shamans talk about spirit flowing through everything and comprising everything. That's what would be considered the philosophy of pantheism, that everything is sacred. Now, pantheism is not something that a lot of people even have in their vocabulary. So, how often do they think about it? Probably not very often. And that's exactly what we want to start thinking about, because if we don't, then we do not consciously focus our attention on that way of thinking and perceiving things that would allow us to actually experience this level of connection to the true nature of things. Now, another thing that we also want to consider is that although many seemingly separate things and entities, beings, surround us or exist in the world, their inner essence, their true nature, is also a part of the same whole. We live in a universe, and by definition, universe means one. That sense of oneness is something that is missing in most people's consciousness, or they hardly ever think about it. But at the most basic level of reality, everything is one. And so the separation among individual things or entities or human beings is illusory. By illusory, I mean it's like in a dream. We look at another dream character that we dream about in our night dream. We perceive that person as a separate being, but in reality, we're dreaming them up. Our consciousness conjures up that character who is made of pure energy of consciousness. They may have appearance of a separate entity, but the true essence of that person or that being is that they're one with the dreamer. And who's the dreamer? Well, if you are dreaming, then you are the dreamer. So you are not separate from the dream characters, although they appear to be separate. So that appearance is illusory. I don't want to say it's a delusion. I don't want to say it's a veil of Maya that makes everything look weird and wrong. Although there are probably a lot of parallels between what I'm talking about and the Indian philosophy and Buddhism. However, I'm not going to even put labels on it. I'm just simply saying that the illusory nature of the sense of separation is also what causes the anxiety of separation. It causes the sense that if we're not feeling one with everything, we feel kind of stuck in a shell. And this shell is made of our beliefs, our perspectives, and certain values that often are not our own values, that have been kind of indoctrinated into our consciousness during our upbringing, education, religion, influences of media, society at large. And what we do is we live our lives surrounded with this shell that basically blocks the flow of chi, blocks the flow of life. And that energy flow that we learn to be in is hard to feel if there is a wall surrounding you. Try to surf in the ocean if you're stuck in the little area surrounded with the wave-breaking wall. There are not going to be any waves, and so there's not going to be much flow to surf. But once we realize that this wall is made of our own attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions, we can do something about it. We can actually change our beliefs, change our values, change our assumptions, and that leads to changes in our personality. Now, what kind of personality would you like to experience or embody, as opposed to the personality that you are used to? So that's a question for you. And I always mention that I wanted to have our discussion more of a dialogue than a monologue. So if you don't mind, I would like to invite you to unmute yourself and speak up if you have any ideas about what kind of person you would like to be or you dream of being. Right, baby steps are always easier to take than large leaps. But what are baby steps leading to would be important and interesting to know. So if you have a dream of becoming a rocket scientist, for example, well, there may be some reasonable baby steps to take in that direction. And when you take those baby steps, they're not overwhelming, they're not daunting. However, each of them adds to the next, and they have cumulative effect, which means eventually you become a rocket scientist that you were wishing to become. And then, of course, the bigger question would be, why is it that you would want to become a rocket scientist? What is it about being a rocket scientist that appeals to you, or what are the values that it would satisfy? What are the needs that in your life that you would satisfy by being a rocket scientist? We need to actually know our needs and our values, and also be aware of our wants, which often are different from our needs. Our wants are often influenced by other people. It's like often we see a beautiful picture of a model on the cover of a magazine, and we start wishing, oh, I would like to be like that person, beautiful and really sexy. That want, I don't want to say there is anything wrong with it, but it's extrinsically motivated. Basically, it's not what you originally would want for yourself. It got influenced by whatever you saw in the media. Well, this type of wants often are influenced by our friends, by our parents, by our siblings, or peers. The peer pressure is a well-known factor, and a lot of people pursue things that they wouldn't have wanted to pursue on their own. They get influenced by other people to pursue things that are not particularly even important to them. So even if they get it, the things that they were pursuing, they may not be happy. You know, like the dog catching up with the bus. And so basically, we learn how to recognize the difference between our wants and our needs, and develop the preference for our needs first. I don't want to say we should never pursue our wants, because it's nice to have status, for example. Who wouldn't want to have a little bit of a recognition of the people around them? But it's extrinsic, so if our primary needs are not met, having status is not going to do much for us. What we learn is how to become real clear on the priorities of what's important, what's valued, and then we pursue the values that are intrinsic first. And we also remember that what's intrinsic to us may be similar to what's intrinsic for other people. We don't want to make assumptions that it's the same thing. But this is kind of the point of interaction or intersection between our independence and our interdependence. What's important and valuable to us may be important and valuable to other people. If that's the case, our pursuit of our own values will actually satisfy other people's needs and wants too. Now, that's like killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Not that I have anything to do with killing birds, but I want to say that it's one of the optimal ways of functioning. We basically get more bang for a buck, so to speak. More benefits from spending a certain amount of energy and time. Now, that's the optimal functioning as a human being. Another student of mine, Kathleen, asked a question in writing, asking if I could touch upon pain and how pain affects others. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And this is something that is a surprise to some people, because it's like, if I'm in pain, how can that affect other people? Well, other people sometimes are empaths or empathetic. Doesn't sound quite good, but actually it means that they feel the sensations or feelings of other people. So empathy is the ability to experience some things that other people experience. It may be a very helpful thing. For example, if you're a therapist, it's really helpful to have empathy to your patients or clients. If you are a teacher or if you're a coach, it's also very important. And it also may be a big nuisance, meaning you may not want to feel everything that everyone around you feels. It may be overwhelming. It may also feel like your boundaries are being violated or just eroded, and it doesn't feel great. So what we do is we learn how to practice sometimes independence and sometimes interdependence. When we experience interdependence, yes, we become more empathetic or experience a greater sense of compassion. On the other hand, we don't need to be always empathetic and compassionate. Sometimes we need to maintain clear boundaries. Sometimes we need to have a certain sense of self-preservation. And we just don't want to be overwhelmed with sensations coming from other people bombarding us all the time. So what do? Well, there are some practices that actually help with that. One of the most straightforward practices that helps a great deal with that is to imagine that you have an umbrella. You know, the kind of a big rounded umbrella that sometimes is made of clear plastic, so you can actually see through it. Imagine that you have this umbrella that doesn't allow these energies to get into your system so easily. It basically keeps them at bay. That umbrella, or you can even continue that image to surround you from all sides like a bubble, basically can create a safe space within. And that sense of safety is quite important to most people. When we experience that sense of safety, we can relax. We don't feel stressed. We don't feel overwhelmed. Yes, it will create some degree of boundary, which we talked about a few minutes ago. That if that boundary becomes so solid, it becomes like a cocoon or like a shell separating you from the rest of the world, then you feel stuck. But if it's malleable and fluid, kind of like a soap bubble. Soap bubbles often are very fluid and they change their colors and shapes all the time. If you imagine yourself being inside of that kind of bubble, then you feel safe inside, but at the same time, it's not a solid wall surrounding you. It's something that allows you to still connect with other people, still communicate. It may filter your perception to some extent. But then you can be a cause of your own filters of perception. In other words, if you're the one responsible for building this bubble, then you can be responsible for what you build it out of. So then we start playing with the energies associated with these filters of perception. And we can actually make these filters work for us. For example, instead of filters that make everything look scary, some people are really frightened, and whatever they look at, they freak out or they become scared. We can replace that filter, and perhaps replace it with a filter of curiosity I was talking about, or something else. Isn't that interesting? Let's check it out. So instead of fear, there is curiosity. Does this apply to everything in life? Well, we can be selective also which filters to apply to which situations. But basically that means that we also become mindful of how we use our filters. We can basically create mindful patchwork of these filters. And we also can replace some that don't work for us anymore with something else. Eventually we'll also learn how to make windows in the walls of the bubble so we can perceive things directly without the filters, which obviously gives us much greater clarity and also ability to connect with the inner essence of others, especially if they also open the window towards us. Now, if one person opens the window towards you and you open the window towards that person, that's what we call love. That's what we call connection from one heart to the other heart. This is something that many people experience once in the blue moon. We actually practice how to do this consciously. So it's a strange idea, perhaps, for many people. How can you practice opening the windows of perception? And how can you practice love? Well, that's what Tantric Qigong is for, right? I do practice Tantric Qigong, and I teach it, and we study it at a relatively deep level. And as we progress through our practices, we see how all different aspects of Qigong are interconnected. So we learn basically how to practice opening and closing these windows at will, placing the filters, replacing them, choosing which ones work best for us, and also if we feel like some filters don't work for us anymore, we let them go. So how does this pertain to pain? Because the original question was about pain. Well, it basically has everything to do with pain, because pain is not in itself a problem. Pain is a physiological feedback. When a certain part of the body sends the signal to the central nervous system, hey, pay attention here, something is not working properly. When we create a story about this pain, oh my God, this pain has been bugging me all this time. Why does this shit happen to me? I'm a good person. Why do bad things happen to good people? All this kind of nonsense basically turns into a never-ending storyline. And the story is what creates suffering. So let's separate pain from suffering. Other people usually will not be suffering from our pain as much as they will be suffering from our suffering. Because nobody wants to be in the company of a person who is constantly bitching and moaning about their pain. But it's also important to have some degree of compassion. So if somebody is complaining about pain, we want to be able to help them address the pain. And that's one of the things that we study. We learn how to work with pain body. I developed this whole modality called pain body healing. And we learn how to not only address our own pain body, we also help other people address their pain body. And by pain body, I mean exactly that. The story about how something is wrong, unjust, screwed up, and basically this constant repetition of the story creates a sense of identity. We begin to identify with the character in that story, who is constantly being subject to all kinds of bad things. Now, when we identify with the character in the story, we are no longer living our own life, we live the life of that character. And when that happens, we are not authentic. We are not experiencing sense of self-agency anymore and feel like we are at the cause of our life. We feel like the character in the story who's constantly struggling and suffering. And so working with the distinction between pain and suffering allows us to actually separate them. We can work with the suffering to stop perpetuating the suffering. And the pain body responds. It actually begins to dissolve if we no longer identify with that character who's constantly struggling and suffering from pain. We no longer feel like that person. Now we have to discover who we really are instead of that character. And that is where coaching comes handy. We actually need somebody to help us. Usually it's a lot easier to do it with the help of another person, especially if that person is specially trained to provide that kind of help. Our friends perhaps could help us too, but very few of our friends have the skills and have the motivation to actually go into deep exploration of who we really are. And often they don't have the time or the tenacity to continue doing that over and over again, meaning if they do it once in the blue moon, we're lucky. But very few friends of us actually, of ours, will continue working with us on a weekly or bi-weekly basis because they don't have time for that. But that continuity of coaching is what makes coaching so effective. The coach also keeps the client consistent, and that consistency is what creates the sense of progress. If we feel like we are progressing, even though we may be progressing slowly, not as fast as we would like to, but that sense of progress feels great, as opposed to being stuck at a plateau or even backsliding. And also, when the coach makes the commitment to help us be a better person. And if somebody actually makes that commitment, well, that would be silly not to take advantage of that. That's the commitment that I made to you guys. In other words, if you would like to work with me or with one of my apprentices, I would love to work with you. And either myself or my apprentices will actually walk you along the path of experiencing that kind of transformation that we were just talking about. That kind of transformation will not only make you a better person, because you are not separate from the universe. Making yourself a better person actually makes the world a better place. Now, who wouldn't want that? If we experience awakening or enlightenment, the whole world becomes more enlightened. That's something to pursue. I personally consider that the primary motivation for my practice. Remembering that and consciously projecting that is something that turns our personal development practice into the practice of making our world a better place as a whole. So that's why when I talk about practice, I don't separate my personal spiritual practice, my coaching practice, my practice as a spiritual teacher. Anything is integrated, or at least nestled like the Russian nestling dolls. But thank you once again for joining me today. We ended up going for a lot longer than I was planning on doing, but I hope that it was valuable to you. And I will look forward to seeing you next Saturday. We're going to be meeting again, the same place, the same time. Until then, have a wonderful week.